Okay, I know you've been sitting a while, so let's have everybody stand up for just a second. No heckling there, Mr. Shea. Okay, so many of you I know, like Christine said, there's a lot of familiar faces in the crowd, and so it's great to be here today to talk about a subject that I think we're all pretty familiar with. But I want you to stand up, and because I want this to be more of a discussion, so let's just kind of gauge the room. If you have worked in this field for a year or longer, please stay standing. Okay. If you've worked in the field 5 years or longer, stay standing. Okay. 10 years or longer, stay standing. 15 years or longer, stay standing. 20 years or longer, stay standing. 25, 30, and closer, 35, 40. All right, thank you. So that's a great illustration to show that there is a ton of experience in this room. And so this is really more, we'd like this to be a dialogue or a conversation about this topic because it's not a new topic to most of us. We're talking about building pathways to alternatives to detention. And so this is a topic like Christine said I'm passionate about. This is my first job out of college, was working in the Lancaster County Juvenile Detention Center. It used to be called the Attention Center when it was over by Lancaster Manor. Much different facility than the beautiful one that they have today. And I grew up in western Nebraska, okay, small town. My graduating class was 22 people. So I was fresh out of college, and I'm going to work in the detention center, right? And I'm thinking, I got to have my game face on. These are going to be hardcore kids. And I worked there for 5 years, second shift. And we all know that working with kids and second shift is kind of when all the crazy stuff happens sometimes, you know. But I can count probably on my one hand, probably a handful of kids that I had to say I was really kind of scared of. In all that time, the rest of the kids that I worked with, realizing, and you learn their stories, and we realize they're kids, right? Making some mistakes, not making some good choices, coming from a lot of different backgrounds and circumstances. And we have a lot of opportunity to work with those young people and families. And so really today, the purpose of talking about this is alternatives to detention was something that's been kind of a big push through LB 561 and 464. It's something that many of your communities around the room have been working on for a long time. So we really just want to have a discussion today, Judge Gendler and I and Christine, as we put this presentation together to talk about, you know, what's been working in our communities, where can we go and do even better with alternatives to detention for young people. So just a really, I'm going to talk just a brief overview about some of the data and about a little bit about alternatives to detention. I'm going to have Judge Gendler talk about what they've been doing in Sarpy County, and then we'll just kind of wrap up with questions and conversation about what you've been seeing in your communities. So I'm not going to make you stand up on this question, but I bet if we all think back to when we were about 16, 17, 15, whatever, we can probably think of some things that we did as kids that maybe should have landed us in contact with law enforcement, maybe even landed us in a detention center. I'm not going to make you out yourselves. But what this slide shows is that most of us grow out of that behavior. Most young people, the research shows, grow out of that offending type behavior. And that's important when we look at this slide and talk about that detention does lead to worse outcomes. And I want to make it very clear that it's not the detention place. Okay, especially in Nebraska, we're very fortunate. We have very well-run detention centers. We have Nebraska jail standards that have standards about what our facilities are required to do. We have excellent education programs and different types of things to make sure that our kids are safe and well cared for in detention. But what this is talking about is it's the process of detention. It's the process of removing that young person from their community, from their home, from their environment, from their school, that can lead to those worse outcomes. More likely to become involved with alcohol and drugs, to penetrate deeper into the system, to drop out of school. So if we think about the fact that most of our young people are going to grow out of the behavior, but if we interrupt that and put them in a detention, and we could send them on a completely different trajectory. And so it's really important to keep that in mind as we talk about this topic. So thinking about just kind of setting the stage for talking about alternatives, we have to make sure and talk about what the purpose of detention really is, right? If we're going to really hold to the true purpose of detention, we're talking about the only kids that should go into detention are those kids that are a risk to public safety or a risk to, or a flight risk. But we know that there's other kids sitting in detention for other reasons. What are some of the other reasons kids are sitting in our detention centers today? Risk to themselves. No placements. What else? Anything else? Do they run away a lot? Sometimes we get some of these kids that they just keep running away and we don't know what else to do with them, right? Okay. So there's other reasons why kids are sitting in our detention centers. And so that's why we're talking about this topic. We have to figure out a way to make sure that we're really using the detention for the purpose that it's designed for. One of the things to be able to do that is that we have some kind of objective screening instrument to figure out what kids should go into detention and what kids could go into an alternative. And as we work in JDAI, Christine alluded to that probation is the lead agency for Juvenile Detention Alternatives Initiative. It's an initiative funded out of the Annie Casey Foundation. And Sarpy County and Douglas County are two local sites. And probation is the lead agency as we take the objectives of JDAI statewide. One of those objectives is objective admissions. It's something that really isn't new to us because it's something that's been happening in Nebraska since early 2000s because the statute gives probation that role in the system to have a screening instrument to determine whether kids go into detention or go into a detention alternative or can be released. And so we use an objective screening tool. It's gone through several generations and will continue to go through generations because we want to be data driven. And so we're continuing to look at the data and making sure that our tool is scoring kids the way that it should be and putting them in the right path. Okay. That risk assessment tool is really important because it guides that decision making. It takes the emotion out of that decision making. It also tries to reduce justice by geography so that no matter where you are in the state, you have the same potential path. And the real core reason that we have that risk assessment instrument is because it measures the risk of reoffense pending court and the risk of failure to appear. Those are the two primary reasons, okay? And if you have questions about our risk assessment, we can certainly talk more about that at the end if you have questions about in more detail about what the risk assessment looks like or what it measures or things like that. So now that we kind of have set the stage with the purpose of detention, we know we have a risk assessment instrument. Our risk assessment instrument is only as effective as what we have in place to be able to place youth, right? That's been the dilemma for a long, long time is probation officers have really only had two options, detention or to let them go because there was really nothing in between. So if we're going to develop detentions to alternatives to detention, we need to have some basic guidelines in figuring out how that's done. What's important to talk about is what the purpose of a detention alternative is. We want to provide a non-secure, community-based option for young people who would otherwise be securely detained. So if they score in that 6 to 9 range on our scoring instrument, and we've had to override them to detention because we have nothing else to do, those are the young people that are ideal for a detention alternative, okay? We also want to make sure the primary purpose of those alternative programs is that they're not treatment, and we'll talk about different types of programs in a minute, but the main purpose of those programs is to make sure that those young people show up to court and remain crime-free until they get to court, okay? So if we are going to develop a program, or if you already have programs in your community, here are some main things that you want to make sure and look for as you're either a provider and you're developing a program, or you're a judge and you're evaluating whether your program's working well for you or not. One of the first things is to determine what's the target population. That's something that I think Judge Gendler and his group could maybe talk about that they're working on in Sarpy, is figuring out what's the target population. What are the kids, who are the kids sitting there that we have to override in the most? Right now, a lot of times we're overriding kids in detention because we can't get the parent to agree to take them home, right? So that could be one of your target populations, is how can we put in some crisis intervention, some kind of short-term intervention in the home that we could have someone meet the family there and agree that if we come up with a plan, Johnny can stay home until he has to go to court the next day or on Monday or whatever. That's all. Figuring out that target population has to be based on data. And so we can help you with that in your community. If you're not connected to your probation department, let us know, because we can work with you and tell you what our probation data is saying about who's sitting in detention and why, based on our risk assessment tool. We want to have a continuum of least restrictive options, and we'll talk about what that continuum looks like in a minute. Ideally, they should be community-based. Now, like in Sarpy County, they run a lot of alternatives out of the Juvenile Justice Center, which works for them, depending on what your community looks like, what the target populations you're looking like. In Omaha, we're working on developing alternatives so that young people have access to them because of transportation barriers, of cultural barriers. We want the programs to be there in the community where they can reach them quickly and easily. So thinking of keeping that in mind. Case processing considerations. Alternatives are great. Ideally, we'd love to see that even if a young person isn't sitting in a building, that they would still get a detention hearing within that 24 hours to make sure that we're moving that case along quickly. We want to make sure that these programs balance supervision and monitoring. We don't want to over-supervise young people, right? Because we can do more harm, lower risk. We can do more harm if we over-supervise them. So we want to make sure that those programs are supervising the kids, monitoring them, making sure, but that they're not treatment. We're not putting them there for the wrong purposes, and making sure that they're culturally and linguistically relevant. Okay. What kind of alternatives do we need? We have to look at the data. We have to ask ourselves, why are our youth being detained? What are the demographic breakdown of those kids? Why are we overriding them? Are we putting kids, alternatives to detention are needed at all different points in the system, right? Not just at the point of intake for probation. Judges need those alternatives at the point of detention hearings. We'd ideally like to see those alternatives when we're dealing with probation violations. So as we look at alternatives, we're not just talking at one point in the system, but a continuum of points across the system. So here's what an ideal generic continuum might look like of alternatives to detention. We have our home or our community detention. So a lot of times our probation officers are creative and they work with parents, and we have them sign contracts or agreements to say, okay, yep, I'm willing to take Johnny home and I will make sure he shows up in court. And we say, Johnny, you have a curfew, okay? So they're still going home, but that's really considered kind of an alternative because we're giving them some factors to think about. It could be that we have tracker services. Probation has tracker services and electronic monitoring services statewide. So Johnny needs a little bit more supervision when he goes home, or maybe it helps mom and dad feel more comfortable that that person is in place and helping them. We can do that. Electronic monitoring is another big one to help make sure that we're keeping track of where those kids are, and we have those programs across the state as well. Then we might move up into day and evening reporting centers. Now that's not really something that we would use at the point of an intake alternative, but definitely something that judges can use at the point of a detention hearing or later on in the process. So those centers are a place where kids can go to have that structure, right? We know they need that structure from those high-risk times after school till mid-evening. They can provide homework support, they can provide tutoring, they can provide some life skill classes, those kinds of things to provide that support. But again, it's not treatment. And then we move up to our highest levels of alternatives, such as shelter care or foster care. These are the areas that we're still really lacking in our state, and that we're working on trying to build that capacity to have those available in all areas of the state. So just really quickly as we kind of walk through these are just some of the common types of detention alternatives that we have. If you're using home supervision, we want to make sure that they're in home with a parent or relative. Don't forget those relatives and friends, people like that a young person could just stay with. They might just need to go cool off, and everybody needs a break from each other for a day. That's okay. If it's more, like I said, with electronic monitoring or tracking, it might be an outside provider that provides a little bit more supervision and monitoring. Electronic monitoring, we've talked about that. I think Judge Gendler will talk a little bit about it too. We've come a long way in electronic monitoring. Now we have GPS, some of those different types of things that help us stay on top of where kids are at. But it's a great option to keep kids at home in their communities. Day and evening reporting, talked a little bit about that. As of right now, we could really use more of these in our state as well. I think we have them in Sarpy and we have them in Douglas. But we're working on developing that capacity with you across the state. We talked about shelter care. We don't have anything necessarily like what we would call a reception center. We have some things that are similar across the state and some types of assessment centers and things like that, but there's an option for those kinds of things to be developed. When we think about developing alternatives to detention, we always have to keep some things in mind, and there's some unintended consequences that could happen if we're not careful. We want to make sure that everyone has access to that detention alternative program. A lot of times that's a barrier, not so much in our areas, but even in like Omaha and Sarpy. I know we've talked a lot with Dick. Transportation's an issue in Sarpy County because there's not a lot of public transportation. So getting a young person from their home to the juvenile justice center is a barrier sometimes. So thinking through what types of access young people might have to that programming, or that our providers have, and getting access to those young people. Where do they do the intake? Can they go out somewhere to hook up that monitor? Are those providers safe? Those kinds of things. You'll keep that in mind when you're putting these together. Developing detention alternatives without data. This is really, really important. When we work with communities, it's great to see a laundry list of different things, and we can say, yeah, we don't have day and evening reporting. Let's pick that. Let's do it. But that's kind of setting ourselves up for failure if our data isn't telling us that's a piece of the system that we need. Because not every area of the state needs every piece of that continuum. It really depends on what types of services and needs you have in your area. So really make sure that you look at the data before you start putting together alternatives. Be very careful about mission drift. It's easy to start out as an agency doing one thing or developing a day and evening reporting center, and all of a sudden you're doing a great job and that's awesome and people love you, so they want you to do this piece, and then they want you to do this piece, and then they want you to do this. And pretty soon you're not an alternative to detention anymore. Now you've become something completely different. And so making sure that as a community you're focused and looking at, is this the right option for that particular program? We want to be very careful about net widening, okay? The thing about working with young people is that it's easy to work with the kids that are easy to work with, right? So it's easy when those young people are scoring 0 to 5, or maybe they're right on the edge, 5 to 6. They could probably go home, but you know what? Just to be on the safe side, we're going to put them in this alternative. Okay, we want to be really careful about pushing those low-risk kids further into the system. We have to trust our data and trust our tools so that we are only putting the right kids in those alternatives and not widening that net. And then, of course, the one that's always on the list, right? Funding. Where's the money going to come from for developing these alternatives? And how do we keep it sustained, and how do we keep it going? That's a huge issue. That's why we're here, and it's great that your teams are here because it's a collaborative effort. We have to work together. That's one of the intentions of the LB 561 dollars and the community-based aid dollars, is to help develop those kinds of alternatives. Probation is at the table wanting to work with you so that all kids have access to alternatives. So there's other types of grant money, all kinds of different things. So be creative and work together. This slide is just kind of more for your reference as you go back home and your teams are meeting and you're thinking maybe we want to look at developing an alternative. Here's what we would recommend, that the kinds of data that you would track from your providers that would help you make sure that they're staying on track and you're avoiding that mission drift. And then at the system level, are we utilizing those alternatives? Are we utilizing them to their capacity? And are we having an impact on detention numbers? Are kids failing to appear? Are they doing what they're supposed to be doing? So these are some guidelines for you in terms of looking at the data. There's always a place for youth and family voice in developing alternatives. So it's important that if you have youth and families in your communities, engage them. Talk to them. Are they able to access? What are ways that would help them access programs if you had them in place? A lot of times at day and evening reporting centers is a great opportunity to engage parents, offer parenting classes or family support groups, different things like that, family events. So making sure that we don't forget that voice, because that voice is really, really important. So that's my little spiel, and I'm going to turn it over to Judge Gendler to talk about the real work that they're doing.
I'm really lucky because I've worked in the same building for 37 years. 15 of those years were in the county attorney's office, and 1 year I was a clerk. And early on, I met Dick Shea. I don't mean to embarrass him, but at the time, Dick was the principal at a parochial high school in Sarpy County. And a lot of our success is because of Dick. He has taken a lot of things on and run with it, and as a result, we've got a lot of choices in our system that I don't think we would have had otherwise. I remember early on when I first met Dick, he would bring a couple kids occasionally to the courthouse to meet me because they were residents of Douglas County and they needed something, but they were in Sarpy County now, so venue meant we could do something. And a couple of those kids on occasion had been abused at home, and he was worried about them. One of the things that we did a long time ago, this is over 25 years ago, is we started a collaborative group called Safe Policy. And these were school principals, probation, the Department of Health and Human Services, the courts, attorneys, other interested parties, and we would discuss common issues. And with JDI, what we've done is expanded that group to include the folks we want to include with JDI. But we met regularly over a period of years, and as a result, we have a pretty good working relationship. Electronic monitoring is how we got Dick initially. The sheriff's office, and I have to plug this for the sheriff's office as well. We've had two sheriffs during my tenure in the building, both of whom agreed to take on the responsibility of adding more programs for youth. So there were grant applications to the Crime Commission, there were other things that were pursued, and the sheriff agreed to put that in their budget. So our electronic monitoring program is in the sheriff's office budget. We have 4 levels to our program. The first 2 levels, the youngsters wear a monitor. The second 2 levels, the monitor comes off. For example, when they're on level 2, they get a 4-hour outing. But there's a lot of checks with those youngsters while they're on this program. But frequently, they can come back to court after their initial hearing and perhaps be off the monitor onto level 3 and then level 4. We typically don't let them off the monitor unless they're passing all of their classes. We did have an evening reporting center before we got into the JDI project. And we had tracker services that we could contract with. And we have a community service coordinator in the county. The one we had for a number of years just left. We have another one. But the nice thing about this, it's funded, by the way, mostly by the adult court system. The adult offenders pay a fee to the community service coordinator. In Sarpy, for the juveniles, if they can afford it, we assess a $10 fee. But this person coordinates all of our community service and tries to match some of it with their interests. So if a youngster is interested in auto mechanics, we might have them do community service at the Sarpy garage or the SAC garage. And we've had a lot of support with that. And then we have an alternative school. And this, was it 10 years ago? I can't remember. Yeah. So traffic school, right? If you're a first-time offender for a traffic offense, you'll attend traffic school. Well, they were going to the traffic school at the Omaha Safety Council, and the money was going there. So our sheriff and the county attorney thought we ought to have a traffic school in Sarpy and have the money stay here. And we have 6 school districts that operate within our county, and that includes OPS and Millard, which are housed out of Douglas County. So as a result, those funds were collected and used to establish an alternative education program. We have one program within our detention facility, and then we have a program outside the detention facility. And that program gets filled rather rapidly. It's also the alternative expulsion program. But those kids get a lot of individual attention. We have a woman, Barb van Wozenhaven, who assesses a lot of these youngsters to let us know where they're at educationally and what they need, so when they can get mainstream back to their home school, people are aware of what those needs are. Monica, oh, you got it. Yeah, thanks. Okay, so now we have JDI, and I was a real skeptic, to be honest with you, because I didn't think we needed one more meeting, and actually none of us did. I went to I think it was Houston, and I thought, well, maybe there's something here that we can take back. But as we got into this, we realized that there was a lot that we could do. And one of the things that JDI did was give us cover with some of those that drive policy in our county to expand these services. We have county commissioners that come to our meetings and are very supportive. And even during this 561 and 464 process with the legislation and the switch of money and the initial or the extra burden on the counties, we've had a lot of support from our county commissioners with regard to some of the things that we're trying to do. And by the way, I do want to put a plug in. There's $5 million because of LB 561 and 464 community aid grant dollars that are available to be distributed across the state. We're hoping that gets increased to $10 million. Every county is entitled to at least $5,000 if they have a 3-year juvenile plan. And contiguous groups of counties can combine. So if you're from a jurisdiction that hasn't been pursuing these funds, I suggest you pursue them. One thing that we realized as we traveled across the state is you need somebody to administer those grants. And again, I'm lucky because the sheriff's office has taken on a lot of these responsibilities. But I do suggest if you're from a smaller jurisdiction to contact Cindy Gans at the Crime Commission to come up with a plan to access that money. And hopefully there'll be more money in the future. Our detention population was roughly 10 to 12 youngsters per day from Sarpy. And we have other youngsters from other counties that were housed there as well. As a result of JDI, our populations dropped to roughly 5 to 6 a day, so roughly a half. And because of the graduated sanctions that was passed under LB 800, Senator Asher's bill several years ago with the graduated sanctions, probation also had this increased responsibility of not just detaining somebody right away when they committed an offense or violated probation. So one of the things that we did was we made contact with a program called Love a Lamb. It's a sheep farm where they work with disabled youth. And our youngsters go out there to do community service, and they love it. They like it a lot better than the landfill where they used to have to go on occasion. We've expanded our evening reporting center hours. We have day and evening from 4 to 8 p.m. 4 to 6, is it 4 to 6, I think, for the tutoring? And we have tutors that are there to assist with youngsters. We've also started what's called the PASS program. That's a program for youth who are struggling in school, who have been truant in school. We'll have people go out to the house and wake them up and get them to school if they're not there. And we'll bring them back to the evening reporting center and the day reporting center for additional tutoring assistance. The tracker program, this is a great idea. We've got employees, because our numbers were reduced in detention and numbers are reduced on the electronic monitoring program. The issue is, what do you do with these employees? Because we don't want to see them go. They're terrific. So what the sheriff's office and Dick has done is started a new tracker program in our county. We have 3 levels to it. The first level is similar to the level 1 of our electronic monitoring program. Then there's level 2 or level 3. And as judges, we can decide which level that youngster enters the tracker program. I mentioned this truancy prevention with our PASS program. In your packet, you're going to find also a bond contract, and we've been doing this for years and doing more of it. It's essentially like a probation contract for youth who come into the system prior to adjudication, where they report to a probation officer. We have some youngsters where their cases get transferred from the adult system, and they've posted a bond, so that's why the space is on that form in case that bond still remains in effect. But that's something that we've utilized in lieu of electronic monitoring, tracker, or detention. I also want to talk about our weekends, because probation emails, they scan an email to us, the arresting officer's affidavit, the scoring sheet, and also their detention summary. And with those scoring instruments and those sheets, typically they get released. Sometimes they might get released and put home on electronic monitoring, the CARE program. And over the weekends, I'll communicate with the attorneys, and they're mostly sitting over there. They're really great about checking the email. So if we have a youngster that gets detained because there wasn't somebody available to send them to, they might find a solution over the weekend. So before the hearing on Monday morning at 8:30, we've got that youngster released. Or perhaps we've released them on electronic monitoring. We really don't want them to come to court and miss school. Can we get a stipulation signed to provide for that and have them come back to court at a later date? So that's something that we do frequently now, and I think it's made a difference. And we have the luxury across the state, these cases are down, fortunately. The new filings are down, and the trend is supposed to continue. In our county, we had a criminal justice specialist come in and talk to us about future planning. And roughly across the country, crime is down 25%, incarceration rates are down 25%, convictions are down 25%, except in our state penitentiary system. And we all know that mental health is one of those issues that drives that figure up. But the cases are diminishing in numbers, which is really terrific, and that's given us the opportunity to schedule some open time on our calendar, which we use. So if a youngster needs a hearing, we've got somewhere to put it. Both Bob and I have Tuesday afternoons available, alternating Thursday afternoons available, if somebody needs to come into court for a hearing to review something. So as a result, hopefully detention numbers will remain low, and those that are in detention won't be there for very long. I'm not going to lie, we still have those difficult cases where we can't get kids placed. But because of these efforts, our numbers have dropped. And we're going to continue to work on this and continue to work on other solutions. But I can't thank Dick and all the people that he works with enough for giving us these options and these opportunities that we've had. What? Oh, yeah. Not everything works. I tried a truancy court. That was a colossal failure. Don't ask the attorneys about it. Collaboration is a huge key, and as I mentioned, our JDI team, we expanded it. We probably have 40 or so people that come to our quarterly meetings. Then Bob O'Neill, the other judge, and myself meet with the core group regularly to discuss where we're at. We also try to be data-driven, so we look at the data, and as a result of that, decide where we need to go. And the relationship thing, again, I'm just incredibly lucky because I've worked in this building and these people have become my friends. And they're willing to go above and beyond, honestly, for us. And lastly, what works for us doesn't necessarily work for you. But I just encourage you to meet and try and access those funds through the Crime Commission because they're available now and there's a lot more than there used to be.
Oh, you need both of them? I think the other thing I would add too about the relationships and collaboration is, and the data really, is both in Douglas and Sarpy County. Programs are willing, we looked at our data and we were willing to and able to work with everyone. We were having problems where we had great alternatives like electronic monitoring and tracking, but we could only get those kids on those up until about 8 o'clock in the evening. And so in looking at our data, we were able to say, we could even do better if we were able to access those 24 hours a day. And so both Dick was open to that and the judges, and then in Douglas County, the same thing. So now we have access to those alternatives 24 hours a day, which makes a huge difference at 3 o'clock in the morning when probation officers trying to find something to do with that young person. So
I did forget to mention one thing. Every Monday, I think it is, we get a tally from Dick's office on how many youngsters we have in the facility and what they're there for, just as a reminder to us that we need to be mindful of what we ought to be doing. And we get that once a week. And it tells us who's assigned as the judge, why they're there, how long they've been there. It's very helpful.
Let's see. So yeah, we just wanted to leave you with the thought about just thinking as you work in your systems on a daily basis, if it was your child that was in front of you and having to go through this process, is what we're doing good enough? So I think that's kind of what drives us every day. So I think we just open to questions. Alicia?
One of the things that we're trying to do in Lancaster County is to get that, I'll call them, you said the 6 to 9ers, whose parents don't want them to come home and trying to figure out an alternative to detention. And one of the questions that we were struggling with was, how do we have there be any imposition on the liberty of the child, short of detention, how does the court get itself involved before we get something filed? So it's 10 o'clock at night, you've got a kid, there's, they might be able to go to our Cedar shelter, we want to put them on a monitor. Can you tell me about the nuts and bolts of a similar sort of thing that you're doing, or are you doing anything like that? Are you getting the court involved?
Well, we just got a contract with a shelter, so that's available to us now. But people will try and problem solve and find a neighbor or a family friend where that child can go for the night and put them on a monitor.
But are you putting them on a monitor then without any court order or any probable cause
No,
finding? That's what I'm asking.
Well, you have to do a probable cause finding within 48 hours according to Supreme Court rule. We typically try and do it within 24. And so if it's during the weekday, they'll come back to court on Monday morning at 8:30. If it's the weekend, they'll come on Mondays at 8:30. But again, through this email exchange that we have, we might be able to figure out a solution. Does
Do you
it?
have like an order that you'll sign?
I do. I have electronic order. I have electronic orders on my iPad and my phone. So I just did one here a little bit ago. And so those get sent out to the lawyers and Dick's facility, probation, everybody's aware.
What if it's a kid who's brand new and is not represented by any attorney?
Public defender takes them.
Okay.
So I guess I should mention that. We won't let a child be unrepresented in the county. So every child has a lawyer, and typically it's the public defender. So if it's a first offense, new to the system, the public defender gets the email, and they make the contact with the weekend with the youngster and the family.
Carolyn?
We also have ASAP, you might want to mention that they go out, if there's a family issue, sometimes they can calm that down before we get it. So that's through Heartland, I believe.
Yeah, what she was mentioning is Heartland Family Service has a crisis intervention team that can go out if there are issues, mental health issues with the youngster, and they'll try and establish a plan to avoid court involvement.
Do you know if the numbers of kids detained have increased or decreased since the probation took over the country?
Since probation took over the country, is that what you said? Well, have our detention numbers increased or decreased?
Yeah. Are there more kids being detained or less kids being detained?
Depends on the jurisdiction. Like Judge said, in Sarpy County, their numbers have pretty much dropped in half. In Douglas County, before they started JDI before any of the reform efforts started with 561 and all of that, and they were over capacity at 250-ish, I think, and their numbers now are down to average of about 90 a day. Less than that.
I heard at the beginning of this week, Judge might know the exact, I think I heard,
Judge Sirkovich.
under 80.
Yeah, you're DC, at DCYC, Judge. Are you about 80?
I heard
90? Yeah. Right. So those are the two, and I would say that's more as a result of the JDI work than necessarily anything to do with 561 or the reform efforts. I mean, the probation intake function in our tool didn't really change in that scenario. As part of the JDI work, we have revamped our intake tool somewhat, just based on recommendations from the Casey Foundation and things like that. And we're about to have someone help us look at the scoring breakouts on those tools to make sure it's really performing the way that it should, maximizing that. I would say, though, up in Madison County, even though they're not a part of JDAI, Mark's shop has seen a big decrease in their detention population. In fact, they're kind of exploring maybe shutting down one of their pods and turning it into almost shelter, I think. It just depends on if they can get that through jail standards at the Crime Commission. And same out in Gearing, they're looking at how they can revamp their facility in terms of that. I know in Lancaster County, they had been down quite a ways until last week. We had a big spike there, and we were not exactly sure what that was about. But so pretty consistently, detention has seemed to decrease across the state. Other questions?
You know, I should mention briefly that the electronic order idea I got from Judge Porter, maybe I think Judge Heidemann does it too, on 3A cases, and I thought, well, this is a great idea. I'm going to steal it. And then I applied it to the law violations as well.
But we've got them on the law
Yeah. So thanks.
I do just want to recognize too Michelle Luters in the back of the room. Many of you know Michelle as well. She's worked with HHS and then has been with probation for the last several years, and she was just promoted to join our administrative office as the intake and alternative specialist. So I'm very excited to have her on board helping me with this work as well. So.
You're next.
Okay, if there's no other questions about this topic, any other questions?